Remember when tree hugger was a common phrase used to describe environmental enthusiasts? Me neither. It's a peculiar label anyway. I mean, I love trees. Without trees, I wouldn't be breathing or sipping this caffeine elixir from my paper cup. Honestly, I'd embrace these magnificent beings if I wasn't currently on the clock. Speaking of trees, you're going to want to hold on to something after hearing these accounts from logging crews who experienced utterly disturbing phenomena in the wilderness. I hope you brought your favorite coffee beans today because I'm certainly not sharing mine. My most unexplained logging experiences from Tim the Logman. I'll be changing the names in this account for obvious reasons. My company takes confidentiality seriously. And truthfully, some of the crew members still refuse to discuss what transpired. After this primary account, I have another brief experience to share as well. This first incident occurred one harsh winter during a logging contract in northern British Columbia. I've been in the logging industry for years and have witnessed plenty of strange occurrences in the woods, but nothing quite compares to this. You can call me Jacob. I was working with a crew of 4. There was Mitch, the imposing fellow from Vancouver who had been logging almost as long as I had, but dismissed anything supernatural as absolute nonsense. There was Louise, our newcomer. His first genuine logging position, eager to prove himself while still learning the fundamentals. Then there was Old Man Riley, who must have been in the industry for at least 3 decades. One of those veterans familiar with every superstition and folklore in the profession. The contract was for an exceptionally remote location, 3 hours from the nearest established town. We were staying at a small camp specifically arranged for the job, just some trailers and basic necessities, nothing elaborate. The entire project was expected to take approximately 2 months. It all began our very first night there. We had driven up that afternoon, stopping at this diner in the last town before the logging road, the kind of establishment that appears frozen in time since 1975. We were enjoying coffee and getting some nourishment before heading to the site, when a local at the counter initiated conversation with us. It was typical small talk, inquiring about the contract, where we were from, that sort of thing. But then, when we told him where we'd be working, his demeanor shifted dramatically, and he asked if we knew about the hide-behinds. Mitch immediately rolled his eyes. He had heard all the old logger tales before, but this man wasn't narrating it like a campfire story. He claimed there had been sightings in that particular area quite recently. He described it as something tall and slender, that you never observed directly. You would merely catch glimpses of its movements before it concealed itself behind a tree, which explains why it was called a hide-behind. He said his cousin, who worked in road maintenance, had spotted one just last month, standing behind a pine tree that wasn't nearly wide enough to conceal anything of that size. Old Man Riley was nodding solemnly throughout the conversation. Louise appeared perplexed. They don't have hide-behind legends where he's from. I'd heard about them, certainly, but like most loggers, I figured they were just cautionary tales, designed to keep people working with dangerous equipment, vigilant in the woods. Our first week on site proceeded normally enough. We established our routine and began making good progress on the contract. Then subtle peculiarities started occurring. Our tools would vanish, later appearing in locations where they hadn't been placed, like a chainsaw file that we'd all been searching for suddenly materializing, balanced perfectly on a stump 30 yards into the uncut section. There were also those sensations, while we worked, like someone was standing directly behind us. You'd turn around, and there would be nothing there, but then you'd detect a flash of movement, just at the periphery of your vision. Mitch would insist it was merely nerves, our minds playing tricks on us, because of that local's story at the diner, and being in unfamiliar territory. Louise wasn't convinced. He began carrying a small medallion his grandmother had given him for protection. Riley didn't comment much, but I noticed he started performing a ritual every morning, walking the perimeter of the work area, murmuring something under his breath. About 2 weeks in, the strange occurrences became more apparent. We'd discover these markings on trees, I wouldn't exactly call them claw marks, but rather long vertical grooves that none of us could explain. They would appear overnight, on trees we hadn't yet cut, always in groups of 4 or 5. Mitch attempted to dismiss them as bears passing through. I've personally seen bear marks though, and these weren't it. After that, we started hearing things while we worked. Not typical forest sounds, mind you. This was similar to when you're in a public space, and someone's having a conversation just quiet enough that you can't discern the words. It was exactly like that, but there was never anyone around besides us. It would follow us around the site, always seeming to originate from just behind whatever tree was nearby. Old Man Riley began leaving small offerings at the edge of the clearing, portions of his lunch, shiny objects he had found. When Louise questioned him about it, he replied something like, "Sometimes it's better to share what you have than lose what you need." Mitch claimed it was absurd, yet none of us noticed him working alone anymore. Even the most staunch skeptic becomes cautious when things turn strange. The incidents continued to escalate. One morning, we found the chainsaws tossed in a pile in the middle of the camp, each and every one of them, despite having locked them in the equipment trailer the previous night. And the locks on that trailer weren't even broken. They were still secured, somehow. So how did the chainsaws end up outside? Another time, Louise swears something grabbed his shoulder while he was marking tree. He spun around, and there was nothing there. But when he checked, there were 4 long bruises on his shoulder, as if someone with enormous hands had gripped him too firmly. But the animal head, that's what finally affected all of us. It was about a month into the contract. We arrived at the site one morning, and there was this fresh animal head, mounted on a pole at the entrance to the camp. It wasn't like a hunter's kill, either. This thing had been forcibly removed, not cut. There was tissue and fur still attached, completely mangled, but the head itself was positioned deliberately, facing the camp entrance, like some kind of disturbing warning. Mitch had no clever remarks about that one. We called the local wildlife officer, but by the time he arrived, the head had vanished, pole and all. The officer discovered some tracks around where it had been, but they didn't make any sense. They resembled something with 2 legs, but with a stride twice the length of a human's. That's when Old Man Riley finally shared what he knew about hide-behinds. He explained they weren't merely logger folklore, they were territorial spirits that attached themselves to certain parts of the forest. Usually, they would just play tricks, try to frighten people away from their domain. But sometimes, if they felt threatened or disrespected, they could become aggressive. That animal head was a message. This was its territory, and we were not welcome. Riley mentioned he'd witnessed something similar back in the 1980s on a job in northern Ontario. Their crew had ignored the warnings and continued working. 3 men disappeared over the course of a week. They found one of them 2 days later, wandering in circles, completely incoherent. That one never worked in the woods again, but the other 2 were never found. Now take that account with some skepticism. I couldn't verify it. Probably just some old logger legends. But after what we'd experienced, well, who really knew? We held a crew meeting that night to determine our course of action. The contract was financially rewarding, but we were all on edge. Louise wanted to leave immediately. Mitch, for all his skepticism, didn't argue. I was conflicted. I had never left a job unfinished before. Old Man Riley just sat there quietly until we asked his opinion. "There are ancient agreements," he said finally. "Old ways of dealing with such entities, but they require time and respect and knowledge I don't rightly possess. But we can stay and attempt to make peace with it. Maybe succeed, maybe not. Or we can acknowledge this section of forest isn't meant for logging, not now anyway." The following morning, we contacted the company and informed them we were withdrawing. We fabricated a story about equipment issues and troublemakers interfering with equipment. In a way, it wasn't entirely dishonest.
The company naturally was displeased, but they eventually agreed to terminate the contract without penalties. Better to lose some money than lose people. As we packed to leave, I swear I saw something, just for a split second, behind a massive old cedar. A tall, thin figure, perhaps 12 feet high, but narrow as a fence post. It moved in a way nothing should be capable of moving, as if it were flowing around the tree, rather than walking. I only caught a glimpse before it vanished, but that was sufficient. Old Man Riley saw me looking too. He walked over to the cedar, removed his lunch bag, and left half his sandwich and a couple of cookies at the base. For the road, he said quietly. Best to depart on favorable terms. We drove out of there as quickly as we safely could. The company ended up sending another crew in the spring. They lasted a few days before they also abandoned the job. Nobody would specify exactly why, but I heard they found their equipment arranged in certain patterns each morning, regardless of how they secured it the previous night. As far as I know, that section of forest remains unlogged. The company eventually designated it as an environmental protection area. Easier to claim that than admit there was something in there that didn't want us there. I'm still a logger, but I pay more attention now to the signs. Sometimes the trees themselves aren't the only entities you need to be concerned about in this profession. Louise quit logging altogether, returned to the city. Mitch continues logging too, but he doesn't mock folklore anymore. Riley retired last year, though he still provides consulting services for various logging companies. Rumor has it, they don't just seek his technical expertise, but also because he can assess new sites and share his intuitions about them. As for me, I keep working. I've developed some habits of my own. I leave a small offering at the edge of every new logging site, usually a granola bar, or perhaps some trail mix. Probably appears foolish to the younger workers, but better cautious than regretful. And I never ever work alone anymore. Because sometimes, when I'm out there, and the shadows grow long, I still get that sensation of something standing right behind me. Sometimes I hear what sounds like whispering, just quiet enough that I can't quite distinguish the words. Now that wouldn't be my final strange experience in the woods.
The Crying Forest. About 6 months after the hide-behind incident, I was on a contract in northern Minnesota. This was also lucrative work, and I figured whatever territorial spirits might be up there, they couldn't be worse than what we encountered in British Columbia. Shows what I know. The job was straightforward. Clearing a section of old growth that had been approved for selective cutting. This time it was me and 4 other guys, all locals except for one fellow from Wisconsin. Right from the beginning, they were peculiar about certain sections of those woods. There was an area, perhaps 3 acres, that they absolutely refused to enter. After approximately 4 p.m., they called it crying time. I thought they were playing a prank on me, honestly, trying to haze the outsider. But on my 3rd day there, I heard it. I was marking trees near that section, running somewhat late because we'd experienced equipment problems earlier. It began as these faint sounds like someone sobbing from a distance. As the sun descended, it grew louder, clearer. It was a young woman's voice, weeping, as if her heart had been shattered. The sound seemed to drift through the trees, never emanating from quite the same location twice. The next day I questioned the crew about it. They were reluctant to discuss it initially, but eventually, the eldest worker there shared the story. Apparently, back in the 1920s, there had been a logging camp in that area. One of the loggers had a daughter, couldn't have been more than 16 or 17 years old, who used to bring them their lunch daily. The story goes that one winter day, she became lost in a sudden snowstorm. They searched for weeks but never recovered her remains. That was eerie enough. But then he told me about the whispers. Said sometimes, if you're in that section of the woods alone, you'll hear a young girl's voice ask, "Are you going home?" Local legend maintains that if you respond to her, you too will become lost, no matter how well you know the woods. The crew had this strict rule: if you hear a voice inquiring about home, You keep silent and walk away quickly without running. Despite my hide-behind encounters, I didn't place much credence in that aspect. It seemed like standard ghost story material. But I didn't doubt that the woods might be haunted, that a spirit might wander these parts, so I remained vigilant. Rain began to fall one afternoon, a tremendous downpour that transformed the ground to mud. The following morning, we discovered footprints throughout our worksite. Most were what you'd expect, our own boot prints, deep and heavy, but interspersed with them were these other impressions, small, delicate, bare footprints that appeared to belong to a teenage girl. They weren't random either. They went directly to where each of us had been working, lingered there, then proceeded to the next location. The truly peculiar aspect was that these prints were on top of the ones we'd created the previous day. Someone had walked through after we'd departed, but they were just as rain-damaged as our old prints, as if they'd been made during the storm, and not afterward. The local workers didn't seem surprised. They just walked the perimeter of the site, checking for any prints leading away. There weren't any, they just ceased at the edge of the clearing, as if whoever made them simply vanished. That afternoon, I heard the crying again. But this time, it sounded nearer than before, more interested, if that makes sense, like it had taken notice. Around 3:30, the crew chief concluded work for the day, claiming the light was fading early. It wasn't, but nobody contested this. As we were packing up, I heard a small, gentle voice, seemingly just a few feet behind me. And I swear, I heard it say, "Are you going home?" It didn't sound menacing or frightening but lonely, even hopeful, and yet I jumped, had goosebumps across my entire body. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around and respond, but I remembered what the locals had advised. I remained silent, gripping my chainsaw even tighter and walking to the truck without looking back. That was my final day on that job. I invented an excuse about a family emergency, and breached my contract, lost my bonus, but it seemed worthwhile. The crying forest, as I termed it, wasn't aggressive like the hide behind. It was more sorrowful, more tragic somehow, but there was something about that gentle voice, about those delicate footprints in the mud, that affected me in a way the hide behind never did. Perhaps it was the notion that if you answered her you might never be seen again. These days, I'm far more selective about the contracts I accept. I inquire about the history of any site I'm considering working, and have learned that every region has its own stories, its own spirits. The hide behind taught me to respect the territorial ones. The crying forest taught me that sometimes the sorrowful ones are even more dangerous, because part of you wants to help them, even if it means becoming lost yourself. #Glimmer Man. Citing * from R. Daniels *. I'm 47 years old, and have lived in the same modest house outside Taos, New Mexico, for nearly 15 years. I purchased the property, 7 acres of pinyon and juniper, back in 2010 when the housing market crashed. It was a foreclosure, and I acquired it for an exceptional price. I've always been handy, so the fact that the place needed renovations didn't concern me. What sold me was the isolation, and the views. From my back porch, I can see the Sangre de Cristo Mountains to the east, and at night, the stars are so brilliant, they cast shadows. I work as a mechanic at Cortez Auto, the only garage in the nearest town. The income isn't substantial, but it's steady employment, and usually sufficient to cover my mortgage and expenses. At least it was until about 8 months ago, when my mother's health deteriorated. She had been residing in an assisted living facility in Albuquerque for the past 5 years, but her Alzheimer's progressed to the point where she required more specialized care. The new facility costs nearly twice as much, and while my sister helps when possible, she has 3 children, and her husband was laid off last year, so I began seeking ways to generate additional income. I considered taking weekend shifts at the garage, but Frank, the owner, couldn't afford it. I thought about bartending. I did that in my 20s, but the nearest establishment is a 40-minute drive, and with fuel prices as they are, it hardly seemed worthwhile. That's when I remembered my land, 7 acres of trees, many of which were mature and ready for harvest. Firewood sells well in northern New Mexico. The winters are harsh, and many homes still depend on wood-burning stoves for heat. I conducted some research and discovered that a cord of pinyon wood, which burns hot and produces a wonderful aroma, sells for around $300. If I could cut and split 2 cords a month, that would cover most of the increase in my mother's care costs. I already owned a decent chainsaw, a steel that I'd used for clearing deadfall over the years. I invested in a hydraulic log splitter, purchased used from an individual in Espanola, and began working weekends. The routine was straightforward: identify trees that were either deceased or overcrowded, fell them, cut them into rounds, split the rounds into firewood, and stack it to season. It was demanding work, especially in the summer heat, but satisfying. There's something primal about the process of transforming a standing tree into fuel that will warm someone's dwelling. I established my operation about a quarter-mile from my house, in a clearing where several trees had already fallen during a windstorm last spring. The location was ideal, relatively level, with good access for my ATV and trailer to transport the wood back to my stacking area near the driveway. I'd work from dawn until around noon, when the heat became too intense, then resume in the late afternoon until dusk. The first month proceeded well. I cut and split nearly 3 cords, sold 2 through a Craigslist posting, and kept 1 for myself. The additional income helped, and the physical labor was a welcome distraction from worrying about my mother, whose good days were becoming increasingly rare. It was during the second month, mid-July, when things changed. I remember the date precisely, July 16th, because it was my mother's birthday, and I'd visited her that morning before returning home to get some work done. I arrived at my cutting site around 3 in the afternoon. The day was scorching, over 90 degrees, but a monsoon was building to the west, and I hoped to complete a few hours of work before the rain arrived. I was in the midst of bucking a felled pinyon into rounds when I first felt it, a tingling sensation on the back of my neck, as if someone was observing me. I halted the chainsaw and surveyed the area, expecting to see a deer, or perhaps one of the neighbors out for a walk, though the nearest residence is over a mile away. I saw nothing, just the familiar landscape of scrubby trees and high desert vegetation. I dismissed the feeling and resumed working, but it persisted. By the time I finished cutting rounds and moved to the splitter, I found myself frequently pausing to scan my surroundings. Twice I thought I detected movement in my peripheral vision, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. The sense of being observed was unsettling, but I reasoned that it was probably just wildlife. The property hosts deer, coyotes, the occasional black bear, and once a mountain lion that passed through years ago. Any of these animals might watch a human from a distance. Still, animals typically produce some sound, a snapping twig, rustling brush, and I heard nothing over the hum of my equipment. As the afternoon progressed, the sky darkened with approaching storms. The wind, which had been steady, began to gust, causing the trees to sway and creak. I decided to finish splitting the rounds I'd cut, and then pack up before the rain arrived. It was during a lull in the wind, as I was loading split wood onto my trailer, that I heard it for the first time breathing. Not the panting of a dog or the snort of a deer, but the deep, measured breathing of something large. It seemed to emanate from just beyond a stand of junipers about 30 feet away, but when I walked toward the sound, it ceased, and I found no tracks or indications of anything unusual. I told myself I was being paranoid. The sound was probably just the wind through the trees, or perhaps the hydraulic splitter cooling down. I finished loading the trailer and headed back to the house, but as I drove the ATV along the rough path, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, just out of sight. That night, a violent thunderstorm swept through, dropping nearly an inch of rain in less than an hour. I sat on my covered porch, watching lightning illuminate the mountains, and listening to thunder rattle the windows. Normally, I find such storms exhilarating, but that evening, I found myself scanning the tree line, Looking for what? I couldn't say. But the sensation of being watched had followed me home. The next day was Sunday, and I typically don't work on Sundays, but the extra money was needed, and the storm had cooled things down considerably. I returned to the cutting site around 10 in the morning. The ground was still damp from the rain, which created pleasant working conditions, but also meant that any tracks would be clearly visible in the soft earth. I took a few minutes to walk the perimeter of my work area, looking for footprints or signs of wildlife. I found deer tracks, a set of coyote prints, and numerous small bird and rodent marks, but nothing unusual. Still, as I started the chainsaw to continue working on yesterday's tree, that feeling of being observed returned, stronger than before. Throughout the morning, every time the chainsaw fell silent, as I repositioned or took a water break, I would hear it, that same deep, rhythmic breathing. It seemed to originate from different directions at different times, as if whatever was producing the sound was circling my position, always remaining just out of sight. By midday, I was on edge. I found myself working with one eye on the surrounding forest, the chainsaw held ready not just as a tool, but as a potential defense. Yet despite my vigilance, I observed nothing out of the ordinary, just the familiar landscape of my property. I decided to take a lunch break back at the house, hoping that some distance would clear my head. As I walked the quarter-mile trail, I distinctly heard footsteps behind me, not directly behind, but paralleling my path through the brush, about 20 yards to my right. When I stopped, they stopped. When I hurried, they kept pace. Back at the house, I ate quickly, then retrieved my binoculars and a hunting knife. I have never been a hunter, but I keep the knife for camping trips. Armed with these, I felt slightly more secure as I returned to the work site. The afternoon passed without incident, though the sensation of being watched never subsided. This pattern continued for the next 5 days. Each day, I would work at my cutting site, and each day, the presence, whatever it was, seemed to grow bolder. The breathing became louder, the footsteps less concealed. Twice I saw branches move, as if something had brushed against them, but the movement was not accompanied by any visible cause. By Friday, my nerves were frayed. I had begun carrying my phone in a chest pocket, recording everything while I worked, hoping to capture some evidence of whatever was stalking me. But when I reviewed the recordings each evening, I heard only the sounds of my equipment and the natural noises of the forest. That Friday afternoon, July 21st, was when everything escalated. The day was unusually still, with no wind to rustle the trees or mask other sounds. I had been working steadily since morning, trying to ignore the now familiar sensation of being watched, when my chainsaw sputtered and died, out of fuel. In the sudden silence, the breathing was unmistakable, closer than it had ever been before. I turned slowly, scanning the trees, and that's when I saw it, or rather, saw the absence of it. About 40 yards away, near a large juniper, there was a distortion in the air, like the heat shimmer above hot asphalt, but vertical and roughly human-shaped. It was as if the background was being bent or warped around an invisible form. I froze, gas can in hand, staring at the phenomenon. It remained stationary for perhaps 5 seconds, then seemed to shift slightly, the distortion changing shape, as if whatever caused it had moved. I blinked, and in that instant, it vanished. My heart was pounding so forcefully, I could feel it in my throat. I quickly refueled the chainsaw, but my hands were trembling so severely that I spilled gas on my boots. I wasn't going to remain to complete the day's work. I needed to leave, to return to the safety of my house. I secured my equipment as rapidly as possible, not bothering to load the freshly split wood onto the trailer. The ATV was parked about 100 yards away, at the edge of the clearing where the trail back to my house began. I had just started walking toward it when I heard footsteps behind me, heavy, deliberate steps that crushed twigs and displaced gravel. I increased my pace,
and the footsteps matched it. I began to jog, and they quickened. By the time I reached the ATV, I was running at full speed, and the footsteps were right behind me, so close that I expected to feel a hand on my shoulder at any moment. I fumbled with the ATV keys, dropped them, bent to retrieve them, and as I straightened up, I felt something push me forcefully from behind. I pitched forward, landing face first in the dirt. The wind knocked out of me. I rolled over immediately, raising my arms to defend myself against my invisible attacker. But there was no follow-up attack. Instead, I heard those heavy footsteps rapidly receding, moving away from me, and back toward the cutting site. The sound was accompanied by that same deep breathing, now coming in faster, excited pants that gradually faded into the distance. I didn't wait to see if it would return. I started the ATV, and rode back to my house, as fast as the rough trail would allow, looking over my shoulder every few seconds, convinced that at any moment, I would see that heat shimmer silhouette in pursuit. But nothing followed, at least, nothing that I could see. That was the end of my firewood operation. I haven't returned to that part of my property since. I sold the hydraulic splitter the following week, and took out a small loan to cover the increased costs of my mother's care. Sometimes, especially on still days when the wind subsides, I think I can hear breathing outside my house, but I've never again seen that distortion in the air, or felt the presence of whatever was watching me.
Bigfoot is very strong. From Bryson. This occurred back in October of 2023. In a remote area of the Olympic Peninsula, the timber company I work for had acquired rights to about 200 acres of woodland. They needed a comprehensive site assessment before introducing any equipment, something that should require perhaps 2 or 3 days to complete. I'm a land surveyor specializing in pre-logging assessments, and I would be conducting this survey. I had begun that morning performing perimeter work, marking boundaries, and checking access points. The weather forecast mentioned a possibility of rain, but that's nothing unusual there. Around noon, I moved into the interior section to start evaluating tree density and ground conditions. The clouds were beginning to accumulate, but visibility remained adequate for work. I should mention here that I'm accustomed to working alone. Actually, I prefer it most of the time. It allows me to concentrate on the technical aspects without needing to maintain conversation. This type of occupation leads to encountering wildlife frequently. Bears, cougars, you name it. I've even observed wolves. You learn to remain aware of your surroundings while accomplishing your tasks. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it became when I reached the central portion of the site. Usually there's constant background noise in these forests. Birds, small animals, wind through the trees. But here, it was silent. Just silent. The kind of silence that raises the hair on the back of your neck. I continued working regardless. Marking trees and taking measurements. I had a job to complete. It started raining lightly around 1:30. Just a drizzle, really barely enough to necessitate a rain jacket. I was measuring the diameter of a very large Douglas fir when I heard it. There was a heavy rustling sound, like something substantial moving through the trees. Bears create noise when they move. Yes, but this was different, seemed even larger. Initially, I grabbed my bear spray, prepared it, and continued working, keeping watch on where the sound had originated. But then I observed the movement. Through the trees, perhaps 40 yards away, something very large was moving, and I'm not referring to bear-sized. This entity had to be at least 8 feet tall, likely weighing twice that of a full-grown man. The vegetation was too dense to see it clearly, but I could see branches and small trees moving as it passed. I watched it for perhaps 30 seconds, trying to convince myself it was just a bear standing on its hind legs. Then it stopped moving, complete and perfect stillness. The rain was intensifying now, and I could hear drops striking the leaves overhead. And then something else commenced. The entity out there, whatever it was, began breaking branches, not small ones either. Branches thicker than my arm, snapping them like twigs. The sound echoed through the forest. Asterisk crack, 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 asterisk. Then it started to shake entire trees, young hemlocks, probably 20 feet tall, bending and thrashing them, as if they were caught in a hurricane. Except there was hardly any wind. I'll be honest here, I began retreating at this point, terrified. A lifetime of experience with wilderness was screaming that this was not natural. I kept my eyes on the area where the disturbance was occurring, while attempting to make my way back toward the access road. That's when I heard the footsteps. Each step was like a small impact, making the ground vibrate slightly. They were following my path of retreat, but staying just beyond clear sight, in the thicker brush. The rain was steady now, further reducing visibility, but I could see trees swaying as it moved past them. The footsteps were accelerating. I increased my pace, still trying not to run. Fleeing from predators is supposedly the worst action. I had my GPS unit out, ensuring I was heading correctly toward the road. The entity was paralleling my course, moving through the woods about 30 yards to my right. Every few steps, it would snap another branch, or shake another tree, as if reminding me of its presence. Then I heard this sound, difficult to describe, like a grunt but extremely deep, and incredibly loud. It seemed to resonate in my chest. That's when a branch came hurtling toward me. It was more like a small tree trunk, really about 6 inches thick, and maybe 12 feet long. It came crashing through the canopy, and struck the ground only 10 feet in front of me, spraying mud and debris everywhere. I started running then. I abandoned all standard wilderness safety protocols, and simply ran at full speed toward where I knew the road must be. The footsteps behind me accelerated too, becoming heavier. Trees were crashing and swaying all around me. Another branch flew past, this one narrowly missing my head. I don't recall much about the final portion of that sprint. Pure adrenaline had overtaken me. I remember the rain intensified, the sound of footsteps drawing closer, more branches and debris flying through the air. Then suddenly I was on an access road. The footsteps halted right at the tree line. In my truck, I tossed my gear in the back and departed as quickly as possible. In the rearview mirror, I could see trees still swaying at the forest's edge, even though the wind wasn't particularly strong. Now came the challenging part, composing my report. I couldn't exactly document giant unknown creature displaying territorial aggression in an official survey document, but I also couldn't, in good conscience, recommend the site for logging operations. Someone could be seriously injured out there. I nearly was. Ultimately, I cited several legitimate concerns that would render the site unsuitable for logging: unstable ground conditions, hazardous tree conditions, evidence of significant large predator activity, limited emergency access. I also strongly recommended that any future survey work be conducted by teams of at least 3, citing that the remote location and potential hazards warranted such precautions. The timber company was displeased. They had invested considerable money for those logging rights, but my reputation for thorough and accurate assessments helped. They accepted my recommendations and decided to pursue an alternative site. A few months after this incident, I was at Walmart. Of all places, I encountered an elderly indigenous man. He asked about some wine recommendations, and before long, we began conversing. We discussed my profession, and I admitted part of my experience, enough to mention encountering something unusual, but not enough to appear irrational. He smiled and told me that some locations aren't meant to be harvested. He explained that his people had known for generations that certain sections of the forest had these guardians, powerful spirits that protected the ancient trees. He wouldn't elaborate further, but he didn't seem surprised by my inquiries afterward. I have returned to that general vicinity since then, but never to that specific site, and I've never experienced any other strange phenomena. Crazy old Kenny asterisk. From Walter D. Asterisk. This may be the most unsettling incident that ever happened to me. A few months after my open heart surgery,
I was cleared to resume working, something I honestly wasn't certain would ever happen again. I mean, heart surgery sounds like a significant ordeal, and it was a very frightening experience itself, but this surpassed it, and I'm grateful it didn't trigger another cardiac episode. I was one of 2 equipment technicians, dispatched to investigate a series of machinery failures at a logging operation in northern Maine. This site had been experiencing an unusual number of equipment malfunctions, the kind that defied explanation given the age and maintenance records of the machines. From the reports I recall, there had been chainsaws jamming inexplicably, brand new chainsaws, at that, skidders, losing hydraulic pressure, despite pristine systems. Most alarmingly, a harvester had nearly claimed an operator's life when its brakes failed during operation. The harvester incident was particularly disturbing. The operator had been transporting a load of logs down a slight grade. When the brakes suddenly failed, he'd managed to crash the machine into a dirt berm, instead of plummeting over a steep embankment, but it had been a close call, too close. The other technician accompanying me was Victor. He specialized in smaller machinery and safety systems, and had a background in industrial accident investigation, which our supervisors thought might be valuable, given the nature of the failures. We were flown to the logging site, which was quite isolated, nestled in a section of forest that hadn't seen much activity until this operation commenced. The access road was barely more than a logging trail, the kind of location where you could work for weeks and likely not encounter anyone who wasn't part of the crew. Upon arrival, the foreman provided us with all maintenance records and incident reports, plus a small trailer to use as our workspace and sleeping quarters. The operation was running double shifts, attempting to compensate for time lost due to all the equipment issues. Initially, everything appeared normal, just the typical wear and tear you'd expect in a logging operation. The reports were detailed and consistent, the equipment relatively new, and the crew seemed more than competent. But once we began conducting thorough inspections, inconsistencies emerged. The failures weren't random, they were precise and targeted, and even demonstrated an intimate knowledge of each machine's vulnerabilities. We discovered bolts missing in ways that couldn't occur through normal operation or accident. They had been deliberately removed from secondary systems that would only fail under specific conditions. Hydraulic lines had clean cuts in exactly the right locations to cause catastrophic failures, but only when the machines were under maximum stress. Safety mechanisms had been subtly altered to fail when they would be most needed. Backup systems disabled in ways that would only become apparent during an emergency. Someone with extensive knowledge of machinery was responsible. Someone who understood not just how these machines functioned, but how they failed. The pattern was sophisticated. Whoever was doing this wasn't merely damaging equipment. They were orchestrating accidents that would appear as mechanical failure under casual inspection. It was only when we thoroughly examined the systems that we could recognize the deliberate nature of the damage. They were targeting components that wouldn't be checked regularly, as long as everything seemed operational. When we presented our findings to the foreman in his office, a converted shipping container that smelled of coffee and damp wool, his face blanched. He insisted none of his current crew would do anything like this. They were all experienced professionals who understood how dangerous sabotage could be in their line of work. But I noticed some of the older loggers exchanging glances. One of them, a weathered individual, who had been quietly maintaining his chainsaw in the corner, seemed particularly uncomfortable. They knew something. After several days of careful questioning, one of the veterans, a chainsaw operator named Gus, pulled us aside during a lunch break. He was a seasoned logger, the kind who'd been working in the woods since before many of the safety systems we were investigating had even been invented. He told us about someone named Kenny Boone. Kenny had worked at the site until about 4 months prior, when he'd been terminated following a violent incident. He'd been the lead equipment mechanic, by all accounts brilliant with machines, but increasingly unstable. He was accused of stealing fuel, a serious offense at a remote site, and instead of defending himself, he assaulted his supervisor with a tire iron. The supervisor required 12 stitches, and still walked with a noticeable limp. When security attempted to remove him from the site, he refused to leave by road. Instead, he grabbed his pack and a hatchet from his truck and disappeared into the woods, shouting that they would regret what they had done to him. They searched for him, naturally. The forest was dense and unforgiving, not somewhere you'd want to attempt survival without proper supplies. The area was riddled with treacherous ravines and thick underbrush. After several days without any sign of him, they assumed he'd either found his way to civilization or succumbed to the elements. Now, though, it seemed those assumptions had been premature. That night, Victor and I began noticing things. We heard movement in the trees near the camp. These sounds weren't random. They followed patterns, like someone methodically observing. One very early morning, around 2 a.m., Victor woke me, swearing he could hear someone breathing outside the equipment trailer. We investigated, but found no disturbance in the ground surrounding the trailer. No footprints, no evidence anyone had been there. The next morning changed everything. We were examining one of the damaged skidders early, the ground still soft from overnight dew. We returned to the trailer to retrieve some specialized tools, and when we came back 10 minutes later, there were fresh boot prints circling the machine, deep impressions in the mud. Strangely, these prints didn't match any of the loggers' boots. In fact, the footsteps appeared mismatched, as if someone was wearing completely different boots or shoes. They hadn't been there minutes earlier. Someone had been waiting for us to leave, then deliberately revealed their presence. The following morning, all our tools had vanished. Every piece of equipment we'd brought to diagnose and repair the machines had disappeared overnight. The only item remaining was a hatchet, embedded deeply in a tree trunk near the camp's perimeter. The blade was half rusted, and the handle had been wrapped in old tape, darkened by sweat and grime. Gus took one glance at it and paled. He confirmed it was Kenny's hatchet, the same one he'd carried into the woods months ago. The message was unmistakable. Kenny Boone wasn't dead. He had been surviving in the wilderness all this time, observing the logging operation, learning their routines, and sabotaging them in increasingly dangerous ways. He'd likely been subsisting on whatever he could scavenge or pilfer from the camp, remaining just beyond sight in the dense forest, which he now knew better than anyone. The hatchet was more than mere proof. He was alive. It was also a threat, and he seemed finished with hiding. Now that we were there to repair the machines, he was methodically disabling. He wanted them to fail, wanted to shut down the entire operation. This was reported to the authorities that night, but around midnight, we all heard it. A chainsaw revving somewhere deep in the woods, running at full throttle. A chainsaw revving somewhere deep in the woods, running at full throttle, but never cutting anything, just screaming into the darkness. In all my years working with logging operations, that was the most terrifying sound I'd ever heard. Something so commonplace in logging, but ever heard. Something so commonplace in logging, but emanating from the impenetrable dark, where we couldn't see, coming from a man who potentially wished us grave harm. Victor and I packed our remaining belongings that night. Job wasn't worth risking our safety. We departed first thing in the morning. I later discovered they shut down that site within a month, after too many continuing accidents, too many equipment failures. They wrote it off as a loss, and relocated their operation elsewhere. The only thing they left behind was apparently Kenny Boone's hatchet. The authorities they'd summoned never found him, and nobody seemed willing to touch the implement. That concludes my experience, but it left me with psychological scars. Whenever I hear a chainsaw start up now, Never I hear a chainsaw start up now. Never I hear a chainsaw start up now. My mind immediately flashes to Kenny Boone, if only for an instant. I think about that night, in the woods, when Kenny Boone reminded us that some individuals don't need supernatural entities to haunt a maze, to haunt and seas, to haunt a forest. They just need time, entities to haunt a forest. They just need time, knowledge, and enough hatred to sustain them.
Lumberjack ghost story from Paul. When I was 12 years old, my grandfather Thad first shared this ghost story with me. It concerned a phantom lumberjack. I remember it was during one of our weekend fishing excursions, just the two of us sitting in an old wooden boat as the sun descended. I had been badgering him throughout the day to tell me more stories about his former lumberjack days. He had worked in that industry for most of his life before retiring, and I was captivated by his accounts of massive trees, hazardous work, and my favorite, the folklore surrounding it. Usually his stories were adventurous and even humorous, but that evening I received something different. He spoke in a more subdued voice than he typically used for these narratives. The story he shared haunted me for years, and even now, decades later, I sometimes lie awake, contemplating it. I don't know how much of this is factual, but it's undeniably frightening, and my grandfather insisted it was nothing but truth. It transpired in 1962. He was employed as a crew supervisor at a remote logging site. He never disclosed the exact location, claiming it was safer if people remained unaware of the precise spot. The crew was small, just about 8 men. According to my grandfather, some extremely unsettling occurrences began in their first week there. There were markings across the site, deep cuts in trees, too clean and purposeful to be from animals, often too high to have been made by anyone standing on the ground. Some workers claimed they resembled symbols of some sort. Others suggested they were old loggers' marks, ways that traditional timber crews might claim territory or identify certain trees. But my grandfather had been in the industry for 20 years by then, and had never encountered anything similar. One of his men, I believe he called him Clarence, was particularly disturbed by the markings. He was originally from that region, and he told my grandfather a story his father had shared about an incident in those woods, back in 1917. According to Clarence, there had been a logger named Algernon Pyrite, who'd worked in these same forests. Algernon had been obsessed with claiming the largest trees for himself, marking them with distinctive symbols he would carve into the bark. The story claimed that one winter, after a particularly bitter territorial dispute with other logging crews, Algernon had ventured out alone to mark his trees. When he didn't return, they assumed he'd become lost and succumbed to the elements. 3 days later, they discovered his remains, or what was left of them. He'd been crushed between 2 massive logs, his own marking axe embedded in his chest. How that occurred, no one knew. My grandfather didn't believe such a tale at the time. Nevertheless, inexplicable events continued that he couldn't rationalize. They would return to work sites in the morning to find trees that had been marked for cutting suddenly unmarked, their blazes completely scraped clean. One morning, they discovered chains removed from the chainsaws themselves and suspended around the campsite. On other occasions, they heard whistling. It would begin as a faint sound and would echo through the trees well into late afternoon. These weren't bird calls or wind effects. It was unmistakably someone whistling an old timber working song, the kind traditional logging crews would sing while working. But it might originate from different directions, moving through the forest faster than a person could walk, or sometimes emanating from high in the canopy. The crew began noticing other phenomena, as well. There were sightings of a man in antiquated logging attire, wandering through the woods. When someone would attempt to approach and inquire about his presence, he would disappear behind a tree and simply vanish. One of the younger workers swore he observed something one evening, while marking trees. He described it as a man wearing the kind of clothing loggers wore in the early 1900s. Suspenders, heavy wool shirt, cork boots, but the man was impossibly tall. He said the face was somehow wrong, though my grandfather couldn't recall the specifics. When the younger worker called out to the figure, it turned slightly, and that's when he realized he could see directly through the man to the trees beyond. My grandfather faced quite the challenge, attempting to keep the crew composed despite all the strange occurrences, trying to maintain their focus on work. But then came the incident with Whitfield that he couldn't explain. Whitfield was their most experienced member, had been cutting trees for 3 decades without any serious accidents. He was working alone one afternoon, which wasn't uncommon then, when the rest of the crew heard him scream. They found his body about 50 yards from where he had been working. Initially, they thought a tree had kicked back improperly and struck him. But there were no fallen trees nearby, no indication of such an occurrence, and his head. Well, my grandfather avoided discussing that aspect in detail, only mentioning it had been removed with a single clean cut, as if executed with some type of blade. They never recovered his head. The official report attributed it to an equipment accident, but my grandfather knew better. He'd seen the markings where they found Whitfield, the same strange symbols they'd been discovering on tree bark. The site was forced to close after that incident. My grandfather, before departing for the final time, needed to collect some items from the supervisor's cabin, and that's when he saw it, a figure standing among the trees, tall as a young fir, wearing clothing from another century. In one hand it held an axe, in the other something round that my grandfather deliberately avoided examining too closely. The figure remained motionless, made no attempt to approach, just stood there, observing. My grandfather said he had never experienced such terror. After sharing this story, he reached into his tackle box and withdrew something, wrapped in aged cloth. It was a small piece of bark with strange symbols carved into it. He said he had taken it from one of the trees that day. He wanted a reminder that what he witnessed was real. But heaven help us all, if he wasn't fabricating this tale. Have you ever considered, after experiencing something as traumatic as decapitation, as in one of today's stories, whether consciousness persists momentarily? How long might awareness continue? It's such a disturbing thought. I wonder how many individuals have endured such a fate, only to think, this is truly unfortunate, and contemplate how intensely their scalp might itch at precisely that moment. Well, that concludes this episode of Tales from the Break Room. Until next time, may your coffee be strong, and your nightmares stronger.